time of year when you have an almost 3-year-old and a 1-year-old in the house who don't understand that they've just lost an hour's sleep, and so they sleep for an hour later. Of course, they do tend to make up for it at the other end when they don't realise that they've now got to get up an hour later. But anyway, we'll deal with that in 6 months' time, I guess. I wonder what was going through Moses' mind when he realised that the bush wasn't burning. We're told in Exodus 3 that Moses was tending to the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he'd led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why this bush does not burn up. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, he called to him from within the bush. But it wasn't instant, was it? It wasn't a situation of there's a bush there which is not being consumed. You've actually got to, if you think about it, when something is burning, it doesn't instantly turn to ash. There must have been something there, and he considered it, I don't know, maybe it was a cold evening, we're not sure what time of day it is, and maybe it was some warmth, and he'd sort of stood there to get warm for a moment and realised that the bush wasn't burning. But it wasn't until he'd noticed that the bush wasn't burning that God spoke to him. So I wonder what he was thinking at that time. I mean, it'd be pretty hard to ignore such a spectacle, would it? You know, it was one of these miracles that occurred and that we read of so often throughout the Old Testament. And then shortly after that, you know, we have the rod turning into a snake and back again. And then we read of the plagues which came, and okay, some of those might have seemed like ordinary events to the Egyptians, you know, perhaps the locusts and the frogs and the hail and so on, but the plague on the firstborn, well, that must have been something extraordinary and truly terrifying. I mean, if you didn't believe before, then that was something which was quite hard to ignore. And then you have this situation where the Red Sea parts, and you and a couple of million of your countrymen walk across as the water is parted before you, and you're able to walk from one side to the other. And as you hit the other side, and Pharaoh's army are chasing you with their chariots, and you can see them bearing down, and you saw the water comes back and just consumes them. That was a pretty amazing miracle, wasn't it? And then having done that, you were led by a cloud of pillar during the day and a cloud of fire at night. You know, cloud in the day in the arid desert and the fire. There was no doubting. When you were hungry, there was food provided for you. When you were thirsty, there was water. And if we skip forward from there and we see other miracles which occur in the Old Testament, we've got, you know, Gideon taking on a whole army with just 300 men and utterly routing them. And you've got the walls of Jericho coming thundering down when the army marches around and they blow their trumpets. You've got Elijah who soaks the altar 3 times so it's utterly sodden, and then he calls down fire from heaven and it consumes it. You know, you've got these miraculous signs happening right throughout that time, all handed down through these storytelling traditions and which would have just been so real. It was reality for these people. You couldn't miss what was going on. It was everywhere. And so we have this beautiful little anecdote in a moment. We have this continuing through Jesus' ministry where you've got this man walking around throughout the land, healing people, performing miracles, raising the dead, curing the blind. And so in Luke, we have this beautiful little anecdote recorded just after Jesus has been raised, and he meets 2 of the disciples on their way to Emmaus. And the same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognising him. And he asked, "What are you talking about? And they stood still, their faces downcast, one of them named Cleopas, asking him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem that doesn't know what's been going on?" It was everywhere. There was no getting away from the fact that there was this man walking around, the Son of God, performing miracles. You couldn't miss it. It's such a different world to the world that we live in today, though, isn't it? We don't live in the time of these obvious miracles. We may see miraculous events occurring, but quite often people will explain them away in different ways. When I was growing up, I remember that religion was an acceptable thing, very much the done thing. Most people are religious in one way or another, or at least it wasn't questioned if people were religious. It was something which reasonable and rational people accepted and believed in. And people respected your right to be religious, and they'd understand that this might impact your relationship with them in some way. So, typically Sunday morning you'd be at church, so they wouldn't be asking you to do something on a Sunday morning. And they might mind their language around you because that was good manners and they respected that. Nowadays, perhaps not so much. I mean, it's not unacceptable to be religious, but perhaps there's a question asked about whether it's rational these days. And I can't help thinking that if we had the occasional healing, or perhaps, a city that was knocked down by an army marching around and blowing their trumpets, well, wouldn't that make believing so much easier for people these days? And I guess perhaps it highlights the fact that we live in a different world, a different time to that of the Bible, a time where we believe based not on what we've seen, but on what we've read. And so it's unsurprising that sometimes we have moments like Thomas, who needed Jesus to show him the wounds he'd suffered during his crucifixion in order to believe. Perhaps it's unfair to pick on Thomas here, because it's obvious that Thomas wasn't the only one who doubted. If we have a quick refresh there, if we look in John 20, that Craig so beautifully read for us, in verse 19. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them. "Peace with you," he said, and then he showed them his hands and his side. And the disciples were overjoyed when they saw him. Jesus was crucified on the Thursday, and then verse 19, this is the first day that he's been resurrected. It's the Sunday. And so Thomas isn't there for some reason. But Jesus appears to them. And he understands that they're going to need some proof that it's him. And so he volunteers to them. "Here, look at me. Here are the wounds that I received." And then they're overjoyed when they see him. Perhaps he understood that there was going to be some doubt in their minds. And so verse 24, Thomas, one of the 12, was not with them, and so the other disciples told him what had happened. "We've seen the Lord." Undoubtedly, they would have said to him, we were in the locker room and he appeared. He didn't come through the door. How he got in, we don't know. But then he was there, and then, he showed us the nail marks in his hands and his side, and he proved to us that it was really him. And Thomas says, "Well, unless I see that for myself, I'm not going to believe." Easy for us to pick on Thomas. The others had already seen it. And there's Thomas, who is with them a week later when Jesus appears to them again. And Thomas doesn't get to ask the question, does he? Jesus just volunteers to Thomas, "Hey, Thomas, come here. Put your finger here. See my hands." Jesus understood where Thomas was at, because that's where the disciples had been at previously. And there's no judgment from Jesus there, is there? He's not upset with the disciples. He's been performing miracles around them and expounding the scriptures to them for years at this point. And yet he's found them here with the door locked, afraid of what was going to happen. And so it's easy for us to sit here across a 2,000-year passage of time and criticise Thomas for doubting Jesus had been raised. But he wasn't the only one. And besides which, do we really think that we would have been any different at that time? That's why the words of verse 29 are so precious to us. Jesus told Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet who have believed." You know, I remember John Davey a number of years ago pointing out that if we had Jesus standing on one side of the platform, then we'd be full to overflowing each Sunday, wouldn't we? Be much easier for us to believe then. So yes, it's easy for us to look at Thomas as the one who doubted. And perhaps sometimes we sit here and we see ourselves as Thomas. We look at our family around us, our brothers and sisters, and we perhaps consider how well they've got things together. I wish I had the faith of brother such and such, or sister so-and-so has such conviction, such a rock-solid faith. I wish I had their faith. Have you ever thought that? Have you ever thought that and wished that you had the character strengths that you see in other people? I think we'd all own up to having a flaw of some kind, wouldn't we, at some stage? And I say this for myself. Any words of encouragement which I bring on a Sunday are really designed for myself first. And I see myself sometimes that I'm looking at other people and wishing that I had their faith. So some of us, like Thomas, might doubt. Or perhaps like the father of the child in Mark 9 whose child is so sick, and who, when Jesus says, you know, if you believe, then anything is possible, and he simply says to Jesus, "Help my unbelief. I do believe, but I need more." What a simple request. And scriptures are littered with these examples. You've got Laman, who when told to bathe in the Jordan, thought he could do things his own way, and that was going to be a better way of doing things. Or Paul, who admitted he had a thorn in the flesh, which caused him great distress as he tried to overcome it. And I've certainly had my doubts when fears have arisen within me and threatened to quench my faith. And there are times when you wonder where God is, and I think I might have mentioned this before, where sometimes it feels like God's the child with the magnifying glass, just focusing the sun on you, and like we're an ant. And sometimes it can be hard to feel faithful at times like that. But all of these characters that we read about here, they're there to give us hope. And they give us hope because they're flawed, just like we are flawed. And surely this is why God said, you know, my strength is made perfect in weakness, because he recognises that none of us are perfect. And so we've got this ensemble of characters that we can relate to in some way. And they give us hope because we can see ourselves in them. And so if we look at the disciples, for example, let's consider some of their flaws. They lacked understanding. We read that for us earlier in John, that they didn't understand that Jesus was going to be raised from the dead. And it's again for us in Luke 18. And Jesus is speaking to the disciples at this stage. And he took the 12 and he said, "We're going to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the prophets and the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He's going to be delivered to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, and spit on him. They will flog him and kill him, and on the third day he will rise again." But the disciples did not understand any of this. They lacked understanding. They didn't accept what was going to happen, even though you couldn't think of a more plain way of saying exactly what was going to occur. They just didn't get it at that stage. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't hope for them, far from it. Because even after the resurrection, when he meets these disciples again, he opens the scriptures again and he teaches them. And that's the point when they finally get it, when they finally understand. He never gives up on them, even though there's such a basic flaw in their faith. They didn't understand. And at times they were pretty self-entitled as well, weren't they? They didn't really get the whole humility thing. They were confident that Jesus, as Messiah, was going to rout the Romans and was going to set up his kingdom on earth there and then. And so they fought with each other about who was going to be greatest in the kingdom. And what did Jesus do? He taught them humility. He washed their feet. He met with people who were so undesirable, the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the lepers, and he told parables which even showed Samaritans in a good light. Have we ever felt that we deserve more? Have you ever felt that we're perhaps better than someone else? Ever realised that, had that self-awareness that this is what you're thinking and saying, how do I stop that? How do I change that? Perhaps we start by serving the most lowly in our community in some way. What about the lack of conviction that the disciples demonstrated from time to time? You know, we have just prior to his crucifixion, we have Peter denying that he knew Jesus. He wanted to be there. He wanted to support Jesus, but when push came to shove, he just couldn't do it. Oh, that must have cut him so badly. I don't know if any of us have ever been placed in a life and death situation, as Peter was, where at that moment his entire faith came down to choosing between life and lying and denying Christ, or death and associating himself with him and choosing to be recognised as a Christian. I suspect that there are many of us who at times have had that uncomfortable situation where you've got the opportunity to own up to being a Christian, perhaps to share our faith with someone, but maybe we're uncomfortable, maybe we're embarrassed in some way. How do we get past that? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure that there are many of our family in here this morning who would be willing to share their experiences of how they've handled those situations. And if we're talking about Peter, then how can we ignore that some of the disciples just didn't quite get it with faith sometimes? I mean, Peter was a man who got out of the boat in the middle of the storm and was walking towards Jesus. The faith that must have taken, and that's when he had the crisis of faith. When he's already demonstrated so much, and that's when he sinks into the water and Jesus saves him. Peter, I think, is one of my favourite disciples, and the one I'm going to make a beeline for in the kingdom. I've read this morning, it's funny how when you read verses, and as Craig was reading, when they get to the tomb, the disciple reaches and doesn't go in. Peter just charges straight in. You know, there's that impetuousness about him, and there was that desire to be active in many ways. Of course, we could step back to the Old Testament. We could think about Moses, who struck the rock, or David, who, effectively arranged the murder of the husband of the man that he committed adultery with, of the woman he committed adultery with. So many stories of people who followed God, but somehow got it so wrong. And they often did that in times when they had these first-hand experiences of how wonderful God was, and his miraculous hand working things out in their lives. And so here we are a couple of thousand years later, and we're still believing. And so when we come here this morning, we draw a sight of the world. How much of it do we leave behind? How much of our daily lives do we leave at the door? Or are we, as the disciples were, fearful of what's happening, coming in and locking the door, fearful for our lives? Or are we looking at the events as they're unfolding around us, and what Putin is doing with Russia and Ukraine? We know that there's an outworking of God's will here, but what does it mean for us? In the meantime, until Jesus is here, how does this impact us? Are we looking at events and we're seeing rising inflation, interest rates going up? Are we worried from a financial point of view about our security? Are we worried about where we see things going in the next year or two if Jesus doesn't return? Perhaps some of our Year 12 students are worried about the end of the year that they're approaching at the moment. We know, though, that the disciples were afraid. And so I want to bring our thoughts together this morning, just talking about that fear and how we resolve that. Because fear is typically driven out of our concern for ourselves. We're worried about how events are going to affect us. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the brain works when it talks about fear. because the fear, it's an instinct to protect the self that drives a lot of negative behaviour in us. It can be quite selfish. And the flaws that we've talked about this morning, many of them are driven by fear. So, as I said, I just want to talk about how the brain works a little and how it reduces and processes fear and how we can do that. And I'll preface this by telling you that I'm not a psychiatrist or neurologist. I know that may surprise many people. But there's some basic brain physiology that we can understand just using a simple model of our hand. And so if I take my hand and I just place, and some of you may have seen this before, but we have our brain here and our brain stem, and if we're sitting this in our head, then our eyes are at the front over here. And our fingers on the top, that's our higher level thing. Those are our cortexes, which are the wrinkly bit that we see when we look at pictures of the brain and so on. And underneath, if we raise up, we've got our limbic system here, our hippocampus and our amygdala. And this is where our basic functions are, our safety responses, our fight, flight and freeze responses. And then we've got our brain stem, which manages our basic bodily functions, our breathing. You know, we don't think about the fact that we need to breathe. You might be thinking about it now that I've said it, but typically that's just one of these automatic things which works. It's one of our most basic functions at the brain stem. And so the reason that this is relevant is because fear lives here in the amygdala. It's got a fight, flight, freeze response. And so that's where our big emotions live. Our safety system. It's a bit that if we walked around the corner and we bumped into a tiger, that's the bit which would shorten our breaths, get our heart pumping, get our muscles ready and tell us to run. It's really helpful if we run into a tiger, perhaps not so helpful if we've been cut off in traffic. But that's where fear sits. It's a basic response, and it puts us on edge and it destabilises us somewhat. It gets us ready to act at a moment's notice, whatever we're going to do there. That's where fear is. But over the top of this, we've got our cerebral and our prefrontal cortexes, and these are the clever bits which do all the thinking. They rationalise what's going on, and they squirt little peptides down into the amygdala and tell it to chill out when it's getting freaked out. And this is where we manage language and relationships and empathy and gratitude. And it's one of these things, gratitude, thankfulness, which helps us to process fear. They live in different parts of the brain. If we're fearful and we choose to focus on being thankful, we can't experience both at the same time. Thankfulness will process, it will resolve the feelings of fear that we have. Now, by being thankful, by tuning our relationship with Jesus, we can process the fear that we feel at his continued absence. So in simple terms, we arrive here each Sunday morning weighed down with what we've brought with us from the week. This fear may reveal itself to us through doubt or a lack of humility or a lack of conviction or a surrendering of ourselves to sin. But it can be resolved as we remember with thanks what's been done for us. And so if we come back to John 20 and verse 19, it was on the evening of that first day of the week. So it was the first day of the week after Jesus had been resurrected. And we're told in Acts that this was the day on which the disciples would meet and break bread. And it seems appropriate that this would have been the first opportunity. The disciples who had that final meal with Christ, and here they are on the first day of the week, gathered together in the same place where they'd felt comforted previously. Here they were afraid, and Jesus appears to them. And so they're drawn together, and Jesus blesses them and wishes them peace. And we know that when he instituted that first breaking of bread, he gave thanks for the bread and the wine, just as we're going to do in a moment. And so it's this lovely picture, brothers and sisters, as we come here this morning, drawing away from our everyday lives and the fear that besets us, and we turn our attention to Jesus and the grace which is offered to us through him. And even if we enter here with our hearts full of fear, just as the disciples did, just as Thomas did, when we turn our focus to the thankfulness for what's being done for us, it resolves that sense of fear. And it's that very act of thankfulness, of gratitude, in dissolving the fear of what we think may be. And instead it replaces it with the certainty of what God says will be. Even so, come Lord Jesus.